Danny for Channel 27 News. Tonight we'll be looking back at the Vietnam War. I welcome my guest stars Andrew, Jewel, and Keith Minner. To start off with, those of you who are unaware on why the Vietnam War was, I will explain. The Vietnam War, running to 1954 to 1975, was a long-lasting conflict that pitted the communist government of North Vietnam against the government of South Vietnam. It was also part of the Indonesia War and the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Let us begin our discussion. Andrew, can you explain why Presidents Kennedy and Johnson increased USA involvement in Vietnam?
Well, Danny, President Kennedy has always been a believer in containing communism. I remember his first speech after becoming president. He had made it very clear he supported the domino theory. He thought that if South Vietnam fell to communism, then other places will follow, which would bring a rise to communism in the whole world. He was not prepared to let this happen. On top of Kennedy containing communism, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7, 1964. This authorized President Johnson to do whatever he deemed necessary to retaliate and to promote the maintenance of international peace security in Southeast Asia. So to simplify my answer, they could increase U.S. involvement in Vietnam to keep communism from spreading to the States. It was all for peace.
Great answer, Andrew. Now, you spoke of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which brings me to another great question for you.
Go ahead. I'm up to answer anything. Vietnam may have been a hard time and brings back a lot of bad memories for me, but I'm willing to answer any question you have.
I'm glad you joined me tonight on this touchy subject. I myself do not know anything about this. What was the Gulf of Tonkin incident?
The Gulf of Tonkin incident happened on August 2nd, 1964. The U.S. destroyer Maddox exchanged shots with North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Then 2 days later, on August 4th, another U.S. destroyer was said to have been fired upon by North Vietnamese forces. A lot of people claim that the second attack never happened, but by the end of the day, President Johnson had ordered airstrikes, and by late 1965, some 100,000 American troops were on the ground, with more on the way. This served as the pretext of the ramp up of the Vietnam War.
I had no clue that was such a big part. Thank you, Andrew. Now, Jewel, if I'm correct, you were a doctor during the war, right?
That's right, Danny. That was such a tough job with all the wounded soldiers.
I could not even begin to imagine what you have seen, actually what all of you have seen. Jewel, could you please analyze the difficulty and physicality of fighting in the Vietnam War?
Well, to start, we all know the war was fought in a jungle. This made things hard for Americans because the Vietnams lived there near the area. The Vietnams had dug holes in the ground to hide in to make it easier to attack enemies passing. They also used the holes they dug to put water in and drown enemies when they fell in them and could not get out. Aside from holes they dug in the ground, the Vietnams used hidden traps on the ground that would wound enemies. Finally, Americans did not have enough ammo and supplies where bombs would destroy their tents, whereas Vietnams had bomb shelters for supplies so that they had a lot more advantage on guns. They also used guerrilla warfare, like different strategies that would make them look like they were not even there.
That is a lot to deal with on the ground. What about the aerial war, Joel?
Planes during the war were more sophisticated than in the World War I, and they were a lot faster, making aerial war a big deal during the Vietnam War. There was about 107 planes in the war. Also, helicopters, doctors, and nurses would be used to help wounded soldiers. They had high-speed bombers and high-altitude bombers that would make it easier to drop bombs and not to be seen. This gave the Americans an advantage with Vietnam, knowing the jungle area strikes were big.
Vietnam may have had advantage on the ground during the war, but Americans took to the skies. Let us take a second and go back to the draft. Joel, can you analyze the institution of the draft during the war?
About 2/3 of American troops were volunteered. The rest were selected for military services by the draft. In the beginning of the war, names were collected by selective service system. If your name was chosen, you were to go, but many men were drafted dodgers and would flee to Canada or Mexico just to avoid getting into the war. They also used the draft lottery system, which made any man with birth dates between 1944 and 1950 eligible for the draft.
I wonder how many people actually ran from the draft altogether, but that's besides the point. Let's give Keith time to talk. Keith, can you explain how the war opposition movement developed and prospered?
The anti-war movement began mostly on college campuses against small peace activists. As the war became bigger, protesters got out of hand. Take May 4th, 1970, for example, a Kent State shooting where 28 guards opened fire, killing 4 students and wounding 9. After protesters launched a demonstration that included setting fire to ROTC building due to the draft of more soldiers from an invasion of Cambodia. As there was the My La massacre on March 16, 1978, there was a mass killing between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians in South Vietnam. But American troops they killed everyone, men, women, children, infants. The incident promoted global outrage when it became publicly known in November 1969. For example, the Pentagon Paper. The Pentagon Paper was named after the Secretary Department of Defense studied of U.S. political and military involvement in Vietnam. From 1945 to 1967, the Secretary of Defense, Robert Nash, over it. He felt the public should be informed that the war. So in March 1971, he photocopied the paper and gave them to the New York Times, who posted stories about the event, which put America in uproar. The war brought Americans into protest and called people to act crazy and uncivilized.
It is amazing how what goes on in the world outside the war. People fought against not even have wars. My next question is also for you, Keith. What was the Tet Offense, and please evaluate its effects?
A lot of people did not know, but the Tet Offense was named after the Lunar New Year holiday called Tet. On January 31st, 1968, some 70,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong force launched the Tet Offense and coordinated series of fierce attacks on more than 1,000 civilians and towns in South Vietnam. General Vo Nguyen Jamma, leader of the Communist People's Army of Vietnam, the PAVN, planned the offense in an attempt to both provoke South Vietnamese population and to encourage the United States to scale back its supply of the Saigon region. The United States and South Vietnam was unable to hold off the communist attack, but new coverage of this broke shock and display to the American people and brought forward more effect towards the war. North Vietnam had heavier casualties, yet achieved the statistic victory of the Tet Offense. This was a turning point of the war and began on America withdraw from the region.
I would just like to take a moment to say thank you for being amazing heroes after where you are today, for everything you've been through. This war was one of the most devastating wars fought with bloodshed. All right, Keith, this next question is also for you. How did President Nixon's politics impact USA involvement in the Vietnam War?
Nixon wanted to end the war, and how could he do that, you ask? One word: Vietnamization. When President Nixon got in office in 1969, he introduced a new strategy in which he named Vietnamization, which armed that ended that was aimed to American involvement in the war by transferring all military responsibilities to South Vietnam. The conflict in Vietnam also spurred a series of political changes almost immediately. To start with, the conflict led Congress to lead the military draft and replace it with an all-volunteer army. Nixon saw the end of the draft was an effective policy weapon to demolish anti-Vietnam War movement. He wanted to reduce the voting age to 18. Congress also passed the War Power Resolution, also known as the War Power Act. It restricted the president's power to send American troops into combat for more than 90 days without explicit Congress consent. This was prevent further USA involvement in war like Vietnam. Nixon did not believe the U.S. should be fighting in the war and did everything he could to finally end the war.
You all did such a great job tonight answering my questions about the Vietnam War. I appreciate the three of you for joining me tonight as we look back on the Vietnam War. There was many things you brought up and I didn't even know. Some parts even made me cringe and feel like I was doing a great job. So, go ahead, Keith. Just say, I just thank you for having on the show.
Yep, thank you for having me, Dan.